Hey, Cloudcast listeners. Before we get to the show, we want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Datadog. You already know that Datadog is a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed request traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. But did you know that Datadog is great for your Kubernetes environment as well? Datadog's new cluster agent streamlines data collection from large container clusters and allows you to auto-scale Kubernetes workloads based on any metric you're already collecting with Datadog. To start monitoring your Kubernetes clusters, sign up today by going to datadog.com/cloudcast. Sign up for a free 14-day trial. Try out Datadog with your Kubernetes clusters and get a free t-shirt. So if you want to get better performance, better visibility out of your Kubernetes environment, go to datadog.com/cloudcast and try out a free 14-day trial and get your free Datadog t-shirt. And now, on to the show.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're going to be wrapping up our look-ahead shows with this week's show. And, before we get to that, we want to get to some cloud news of the week. And, we're a little bit surprised. The year has really started off fast in terms of a lot of announcements, a lot of acquisitions, a lot of investment, maybe more so than we thought for 2019. So we want to make sure that we keep you up to date on what's going on with that. So real quick, let's start with IBM. IBM had announced good earnings, sort of first good earnings in a while for IBM. But not to dive into that too much, they actually had two fairly interesting announcements. The first one was with Vodafone. They signed a deal to join forces with Vodafone, partnership arrangement to manage, accessing cloud via 5G. So sort of interesting space to watch as 5G expands, and maybe we start to see some interesting partnerships between the 5G providers. So Vodafone or Verizon or AT&T or any of those with the large 5 or 6 cloud providers. So we'll put that in the show notes. IBM doing a partnership deal with Vodafone. IBM also doing a partnership deal with Juniper. So this is going to be around helping to do networking between public and private clouds, hybrid cloud deals. IBM doesn't really have a direct networking play in terms of technology they own. So partnering with Juniper around that space. So a couple of interesting things from IBM to sort of kick off this week. The next one on the list was Travis CI, which for those of you that are in the CI/CD space or use CI/CD, you're building out pipelines and so forth. They were acquired by a company called Idera. So Travis CI getting acquired by Idera, kind of trying to expand out what that space looks like in terms of it's not just CI, it's a bunch of other tools around that. And I think this makes sense. We've seen Git and GitLab make some GitHub and GitLab make some big announcements. The CI/CD space is obviously consolidating, and people like Atlassian and others are really doing some work around what does the entire developer experience look like. So Travis CI getting acquired by Idera. The next one, which sort of big news, was a company called Confluent, who are the creators of the Kafka streaming database, streaming technologies. Took a big round of funding, $125 million in VC funding for a $2.5 billion valuation. So Kafka growing very, very quickly, and very interesting to see this announcement made, especially after Amazon announced a managed offering for Kafka at reInvent this year. So, again, people can do some homework on what that means, but definitely interesting given what's going on in both the open source world and concerns about Amazon taking that business as managed services and so forth. So, congratulations to Confluent for the new round of funding. Next one on the list was Microsoft acquired a company called Citus Data. Citus Data is most well known for being in the open source space, but really focused on the Postgres database. So PostgreSQL database. Again, Microsoft trying to up their credibility in the open source space, really trying to focus on database migrations and so forth. So interesting acquisition. This will be part of Azure services in the future. And then finally, one that I thought was sort of interesting, both Intel and Alibaba got together with the 2020 Olympics coming to Tokyo, the Summer Olympics coming to Tokyo. Alibaba and Intel got together. They're doing some work around 3D-powered athlete tracking technology. So this is something that's going to be part of I'm sure the online experience, possibly the television viewing experience. So sort of tracking of athletes, 3D level tracking. So not just speed and so forth, but I assume we're going to see some pretty interesting biometrics and so forth around this. So interesting combination between cloud providers and technology providers around a incredibly visible event in the Olympics, and we'll see where that technology partnership goes for things outside of the Olympics. So with that, I'm going to wrap that up. We'd really like to thank Liquid Technology for sponsoring this week's Cloud News of the Week. So if your company is upgrading, planning on migrating to the cloud, upgrading infrastructure, or relocating your IT hardware, definitely give Cloud Technology Cloud Last suite of services a look. It helps organizations move to the cloud. The service team will de-rack, pack, and purchase your excess technology hardware. So why not increase your budget by getting money back for your excess IT equipment? Also, Liquid Technology will ensure that your company's data is safe. They provide on- or off-site auditable data destruction services. Whether your operations are in Ashburn or Amsterdam or somewhere in between, Liquid Technology has expert knowledge in local regulations to deliver a compliant international solution to your company. Liquid Technology is EPA recognized, dual certified green recycler. So if you want to check it out, go to cloudlast.co/cloudcast today, sign up for the service, and you'll win a CloudLast t-shirt, and one lucky winner will receive a $100 Amazon gift card. That's cloudlast.co/cloudcast. With that, we're going to get to our interview. Today's show is going to be about serverless, and it's going to be the last in our 2019 look-aheads. Hope you enjoy it. Let's get to that show. Okay, and we're back. It is the last of our segments that we're doing on these sort of very domain-specific topics, and today we're going to talk about serverless, which seems to still be everybody's favorite topic that we're not exactly sure, all the parts that work. It sounds fantastic. It sounds like it's going to sort of solve every problem we have. It's going to be incredibly inexpensive, and so we thought we would go back to probably our favorite serverless friend, kind of the man who not coined the term serverless, but coined the term Jeff, which is really kind of apropos because it still does help us sort of explain what's a little bit complicated. So Paul Johnston, welcome back to the show. Great to have you back on the show.
And good to be back. Thank you very much.
So for folks who are newer to the show and may not have heard, you were on a little more than a year ago. We spoke to you down at Serverless Conf down in Austin, Texas. At the time you were CTO of a small company who had sort of built everything around serverless. So first off, give folks a little bit of your background who don't know who you are, but also just kind of give us a sense of some of the things you've been working on for the last, 6-8 months around the serverless space.
Yeah. So back then, that was mid 2017. It was a while back now. I was CTO of a startup back then. And since the company decided to go in a slightly different direction, so I moved on from that company and did a bit of consulting. And then AWS came calling. And when AWS come calling, you tend to listen to them. They hired me as their senior developer advocate for serverless, which was a role I really enjoyed for a good few months. For many different reasons, which I won't necessarily go into. I loved working with the guys there, Chris Munns, Jay Nair, all of those guys there, loved them to bits, but it just didn't work for me. And I know that Chris is still looking for someone to go and work with him, or I think more than one person to go and work with him. So if you think that kind of a role is interesting, then I'd get in touch. I've moved on from there in the summer last year, and I've been looking at starting a couple of startups. So one of which I looked at was in the serverless tooling space, and I kind of explored that a little bit. Not sure what's going to be happening there. Probably not going to be doing anything there. And I'm also now looking at something in the using the serverless skills that I've got and the technology and understanding that I've got, looking at something more in the renewable energy space. So, a little bit different, but using my technology skills still.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. And then I'm always kind of on the lookout at the moment for a bit of consulting work and all of that kind of stuff. So, it's bits and pieces rather than anything particularly specific in the last few months.
Yeah, so that's super interesting, especially the energy space. But so let's kind of step back real quickly, because we talk about Jeff, and that tends to be an inside joke in the industry, but also because it has been a while since we have spoken. So let's kind of maybe start at the start a little bit, and then we'll move on to what's going ahead. There's always some things that still to this day seem to confuse people, right? And even something as simple as the definition, right? And so what is, like, you hear serverless thrown around, and then you hear functions as a service thrown around. And so let's start there. What is the actual differences, if any, and how do you define this space right now?
So it's a really big topic, and it's a big bone of contention across the space. So you have all of these different providers talking about, well, our thing, whatever that thing is serverless, and it's a big buzzword that people have jumped on. And so you have all of these problems of defining what serverless is, and a lot of people take it to mean it's just functions. And so there's one thing that's worth saying is that the function as a service provision is a real enabler. It's actually probably the biggest enabler for serverless applications, but simply using functions doesn't make something serverless. So just building something on top of a functions platform doesn't give you a serverless application. It's quite a nuanced way of thinking about it. So just because you're using functions doesn't make it serverless. But in terms of a definition, I came up with one late 2017 that's kind of stuck around quite well, and I still use it now. In terms of what serverless is, and a serverless solution is one that costs you nothing to run if nobody is using it. And I use it as an economic definition rather than a technological one, which is, I think, quite important, so that it stops you going, well, our technology is serverless, because you can then step away and go, well, actually, if nobody's using it, does it scale to zero and cost you nothing to run? And of course, we're excluding data storage costs here. So, if you're storing data somewhere, then you always have to pay for that in some form. But essentially, if you can scale it to zero and then scale it to however large it needs to go, then you essentially have the idea of a serverless application. And the scale to zero would essentially have zero cost for running it. Yeah. So you can't have a server running, because that's essentially, you're going to be paying for idle when no one's using it. So that's the idea of it. And the other part of it is that the application would essentially look the same when one person, when it goes from 0 to 1 person, as it would from 1 million to 1,000,001 person. So the idea would be that, the scaling is essentially immaterial. It's just the same application all the way through. So it's that idea of what the idea of what a serverless application is. So I'm kind of not really talking about what the difference between serverless and functions is yet. So we could go into that a little bit more deeply.
Yeah. We're starting to see, some of the cloud providers will talk about some of their other services as serverless. So the big one lately has sort of been around databases. So, Amazon will call Aurora a serverless database. I know Google likes to say that some of their data services are serverless. And that tends to be more like there's no distinct operation that has to happen that will do that scaling function. To me, that concept is, like on the ops side, it sort of sounds serverlessy, but does that seem to tend to confuse the conversation? Does that frustrate the serverless community, or are they sort of going, yeah, that's kind of a natural extension of what we're talking about?
Sort of. And I think you have to look at it from an operational perspective here. So there's two parts. And I think there's the serverless compute and the serverless data. And I think if you separate those two things out, you can have a slightly different conversation about what is serverless. So the serverless compute, I think, is actually a relatively easy conversation. That's functions, and that's the easy bit. But the serverless data part of it is actually a whole lot more complicated. And I think what a lot of the cloud providers are now talking about is a spectrum in terms of an operational perspective, in terms of how you approach whether or not something is serverless. So something is essentially more serverless or less serverless, and that's essentially talking about how much more or less ops you have to do to manage that data store. So something like S3 is essentially very, very low operational storage and can still be used as some kind of data store, whereas something like a very high management capability, something you need to manage a lot of, would be very different. So you might look at, something like MySQL on an EC2 instance would be not at all serverless. Do you know what I mean? It's a very different, you'd have to manage an awful lot at that point. So that's not serverless at all. Whereas if you used RDS, then you've got more serverless. So, but then you get Aurora serverless, and then you've got how serverless is that? So I think you end up having more of a spectrum conversation at that point. But I think that kind of within the context of the serverless community that's grown up around things like what was JeffConf and is now ServerlessDays, and within the conversations we're having, I think most would look at something like DynamoDB, which is a fully managed database service, and look at that as a serverless data store, because now that you've got fully managed auto-scaling, that's essentially, you don't even need to touch the data store, and it gives you rapid ability to retrieve and write data. So you don't even have to think about it. You just turn it on, and it's available to you, and it works. And you've got something like... and I'm using AWS really as a proxy for the rest of the market. But if you've got something like Athena, which is incredibly good at storing data, but you're not having to run any servers, so you're not having to manage any actual servers. Athena does a very good job of giving you quick, not necessarily performant data, but quick data, SQL queries on stored data. And all you get paid for is the amount of data you're querying over. And it's just on demand. So you're coming back to this, it's on demand. It's not, you're not paying for idle. So that's a serverless data store. And that's what you end up getting back to as being important when you're talking about serverless applications. So I think what we're going to end up with over time is an understanding that serverless is about that, not managing something, that lower and lower and lower ops idea, although I just don't like calling it no ops, because that you still have to understand your operations from the point of view of things like deployment and things like infrastructure and understanding of infrastructure. So it's no ops doesn't work, but it's understanding each aspect of the application, and it's minimizing the operations at each point.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Go ahead, Brian.
No, go ahead, Aaron.
All I was going to simply say was that seems to further bring the conversation, because a lot of the technical folks, we like to consider everything binary, right? It's using a term like serverless or using the term like no ops. It's either this thing or it's that thing, and you're very much talking about spectrums here and gray areas and gradients, and that helps us get kind of focused on the important parts of things. But then we've also seen you on social media at times really talk about, when you move to serverless, infrastructure really just becomes a rounding error. So walk us through some of the economics you've seen, either your personal things or projects you've seen or projects you've consulted with, and how do you have this concept of profitable software? Like, how do you approach something like that?
Yeah, the first and the simplest thing to say is that when we were running Movivo, we had 2 people running the back end. I was the CTO, so I counted as the third person when I was needed, although I wasn't needed that much. And we had 500,000 monthly active users using our Android app, which was backed by AWS Lambda, API Gateway, S3, Athena, DynamoDB, and we had all of that, and we had a monthly AWS bill of just over $300 a month. So we were essentially creating a system that could look after itself, could scale up and down from 0 to whatever we needed to 500,000 monthly active users, and it cost us almost nothing. What most people don't grasp from this, all they're doing is going, well, I understand how to run servers, and I understand how to run containers, and I understand how to push infrastructure up, But what they don't do is they don't go, well, once we've pushed this up, what happens next? What does it look like when you've been running this for a year or for 2 years? And what they don't see is that simplicity of, well, I'm not having to manage, I'm not having to upgrade servers, I'm not having to do security patches on something, I'm not having to work out how something interacts with something else, or I can't upgrade to this, so I've got to manage that. All of those other things that come with running often open source software, which I find often very difficult to understand sometimes. And those things are often headcount problems. So you often need people to do those things. And often when people are looking at their, 1, 2, 3, 5 year budgets for managing a piece of software, they're looking at the software and the infrastructure costs, and they're going, well, we're going to have to run, 10 instances, or it's going to scale up to, X, it's going to scale up to, 40 people, or we're expecting 2 million users over the lifetime, of this project. So I know we're going to need N servers plus, 40% as an approximation of scaling. So do you know what I mean? The numbers are all based upon the infrastructure often. And then they go, right, and to manage that, we're going to need, one person who understands this, which means we're going to need another person. So we don't have a bus number of one. And, bus numbers are, so that if someone, one person goes under a bus, you don't lose all that knowledge is basically what it is, so that you don't lose someone and then, they walk off to another company and take all the knowledge of how a system's run. So you have all of these considerations that you have to have within an organization when you're running software. And serverless takes those considerations and actually removes an awful lot of those problems, especially if you build applications to the point of, trying to do things like one function does one thing. And functions not calling other functions, because what you do is you decouple the entire system. You use the infrastructure to start managing how you interact around your application. And the infrastructure becomes the application. And the costs start reducing significantly. That whole $300 a month figure and the 2-person headcount for 500,000 users, monthly active users, not just number of users and not many of them are using. This is active users. You end up looking at it going, well, I don't know any other companies that are doing that. That size of database on, a Postgres database running in front of servers or containers, you're looking at thousands of dollars a month, minimum probably, just to make sure that it's not going to fall over, let alone what happens if it scales rapidly at some point. So you end up with this point where you look at the infrastructure and go, well, $300 a month it's a rounding error. It's not a problem. I don't worry, and I never worried as a CTO at that point about the cost of my infrastructure. And having been at AWS and having talked to an awful lot of organizations through my role there, and since then having talked to a number of companies, I think I've probably come across two where I've seen someone build a serverless application. There have been a couple of times where they've been badly architected, where they just needed re-architecting and they would have got it better. But I think I've only ever seen 2 times where a well-architected serverless application has actually cost more, and cost more in terms of headcount and people than would have been. And so it would have been better to have built it in terms of containers or instances or some kind of, own hardware on top of in their own data set. And that's across all of the things that I've seen. The majority of cases, it's just essentially a rounding error. It's just so much better financially for the company and for everybody else. So does that answer the question? It's
absolutely.
Yeah,
that's perfect.
Yeah. So you run an event called ServerlessDays. You were, like you said, you were at AWS. You've been around enough beyond just your direct work to kind of talk to a lot of different people in and around the community. Do you find that most of the folks today using serverless tend to skew towards new applications, or are you seeing people augment existing types of applications with some aspect of serverless to help it scale? And the reason I ask that is, I get a chance to talk to a lot of different companies, and there is this one conversation thread that comes up a lot where people get enamored with the idea of, I don't want to manage data centers anymore. I don't want to have to think about scaling. So a lot of those things that you talked about of like, I don't want kind of ongoing operations, but they have it in mind that just they're going to pick up whatever existing application they have and just sort of throw it over the wall on Lambda, and they'll just get all these benefits. And that I haven't seen as many of them, but I'm curious, in you talking to different people in the community, do you see much of kind of modernization around serverless, or is it more, new and greenfield around serverless?
So it's, there are two types of people. And there are those that get it, and they tend to then go, right, everything is going towards or onto Lambda. And their approach will generally be, right, over the next period of time, everything is going to Lambda, or actually not just Lambda, but other cloud providers as well. We're going to go serverless with everything. It is appropriate. And so what they will do is anything new, they will essentially take a serverless first approach. And so they will essentially look at a project and go, how can we go serverless with this? And then take that approach and take it forwards. And then everything new within an organization, it's like, how can we make this more serverless as we go forward? So that's generally the first approach. And that's not that many at the moment, but that's a lot of organizations and a number of startups, but not that many either. The majority are still dipping their toes in, I think. The greatest take-up is more in it's a good idea, and I like it, but, and whatever the but is, it doesn't matter. They generally have some kind of complaint. And so often those kind of organizations will go towards containers in some form. And actually that's been an interesting conversation with a number of people, because there aren't that many people that can consult on serverless applications. It's not that huge a community yet. So, but there are an awful lot of people that can consult on the container side of things, on the open source software that's around. And so a lot of certainly enterprise level organizations feel a lot more comfortable going, it's absolutely fine. We know that if this goes wrong, we can hire an organization or a consultancy, and they've got 3 people, 4 people, 5 people who've got Kubernetes people who can come in and help us fix this. And so we've got this, there's a certain amount of that going on, but they will often dip their toes in to serverless by doing something like, well, it's fine. We'll use it we'll replace some of our cron jobs with some kind of ETL. We'll do some ETL, put an ETL pipeline. We might use something like Glue. We might just put a few Lambda functions that'll do some data processing in some form, or we'll put some form processing for a website, a simple static website behind API gateway somewhere. Or, there's a few, they will dip their toes in. And there are good and bad things about that. And what they generally find is that it's really cheap, but often they will build something and forget about it. And then they will end up with problems later down the road where they just don't know how to build on top of it. So there are organizations that will approach this in different ways. I think I've kind of gone off on a slight tangent there. I mean, did you want to kind of come back with a few questions?
No, so I'll flip it to technology just for a second.
Yeah.
At this point, I think it's pretty safe to say AWS Lambda is clear leader in this space. And, why do you think it seems like so many of the other cloud offerings are so far behind? Is it just they announced it first? Like, help us out a little bit with why Lambda almost became synonymous with the term serverless?
There's a part of me that has some. I find this quite a difficult one to answer.
Oh, okay. This is interesting.
It's partly because I have a very strong opinion on why I think AWS is winning this and winning it very, very clearly. And the strength of my opinion comes from having been on the inside. And I'm not giving anything away, I don't believe, in any of this opinion. So I'm quite happy to share it. I just think that the other cloud providers don't fully understand Lambda. And I don't think they fully understand what Lambda is. I think they understand what running code is in terms of Lambda's execution model and running code in the way that Lambda runs code. But the real key difference between the majority of other cloud providers and Lambda is that Lambda has, I think they announced they've got 47 different event sources for AWS Lambda within the ecosystem. There's 47 different ways that you can trigger a function to run by doing things like adding a record into a database or pushing a file into S3 or authorizing a new user or using an Alexa skill or all of these various different mechanisms that without you having to think about the mechanism, you can get from one state to another in an application without having to code it. So you end up with this situation where your infrastructure becomes your application. And when you look at the other cloud providers' approaches to application development, they're still very, very code-driven. And I think you end up with this understanding that AWS's approach to applications is essentially pushing the whole ecosystem, its whole development environment towards, we want you to run your whole application in infrastructure. And when you look at something like Azure, and when you look at something like GCP and Google, and you look at IBM, you look at the way that they do it, and they're still stuck in we want you to run your code on our systems. And I think that's the fundamental problem, which is that until you step back and go, okay, we don't want you just to run code. We want you to run applications on infrastructure. Until you change that process, until you change that mindset, then the other providers will still be behind. And I don't think it will be enough for them to just catch up. I think the other providers need to overtake to start making ground. Because I think AWS will continue to walk away with this, and they will walk away happily for the next 10 years. And I think we'll be talking about second place. And I think, and there's a part of me that says that with a slightly heavy heart, because actually I think AWS could do with the competition. So there's an awful lot in that. And you look at what AWS announced at reInvent around Lambda. Something like, you look at Firecracker, you look at layers, you look at bring your own runtime, and all of those things essentially were things that the other providers don't have. Bring your own runtime is a slightly different one, but the other providers don't have those capabilities in the same way as Lambda does. And I think you just see the iterations happening within Lambda, and they're going to happen more and more quickly. And when it starts happening more quickly, and over the next year, if we don't see another one of the cloud providers really stepping up within this space, I think the serverless space will be lost to AWS.
Interesting. Yeah. And again, like you mentioned, you were there for a little while. You're not really giving away any sort of internal secrets. It's more of a, having just been around the community and lived with it. Yep. Let me ask sort of one final question, because I want to be conscious of time. Just at a very high level, as you look at what you've done with the technology, you look at what the community's doing, what are some of those things that you think today are working very well? What part of, say, the technology stack or the understanding works really well? And then maybe what are a couple of things that you think still have a decent way to go? Like you mentioned, you looked into some of the tooling spaces, observability, security. What are some of the highs and lows, or sort of goods and bads as you look out into where we are today in 2019 and then going forward?
So I think what's working well, I think we're beginning to start getting our heads around some of the best practices. I think and that's not because I've written a best practice blog post that people like. I think we as a community are starting to coalesce around some of these ideas. I think the Serverless Days community is growing. There are something like 8 Serverless Days happening between the beginning of 2019 and the end of April. I think there are 5 in the US or something ridiculous. And this is a conference that started from a mad idea in April 2017 and has turned into community conferences everywhere. And we don't run them; they're locally led and locally run. So I think the community is beginning to grow. The community is beginning to find its feet and start having a voice. So I think that's one thing that's really good. And it's starting to decide what it wants to be and the kind of direction it wants to go in. So I think that's one area that's working really well. I think there are some really interesting companies that are coming through that are looking like doing some really interesting things in the observability space and the monitoring space. So I think those areas are pretty well catered for. I think in terms of what things that are complicated and missing, in terms of the tool set and in terms of what the community thinks is probably missing, I think we have properly looked at the areas of managing the application as a whole. When you move from the idea of code as application to infrastructure as application, then your idea of what a deploy is changes, because your application is not code, your application is infrastructure, then a deploy changes. And if you decouple everything, then your deploy changes. You do atomic deploys in a very different way. So you end up with this idea of how do you do deployment? Do you deploy separately elements in different ways? Do you deploy the whole thing like you would with something like a container? Do you deploy? Does it matter if you deploy in different ways? So I think we've got a conversation going on around deployment that still hasn't happened, and that will then, go on and change into the world of CI, CD, and all of those parts, because we will impact into that world as well, and that comes back into changing the mindset of the ops and the DevOps world as well. And I think we will start to change the mindsets of people there as well. And I think we're starting to have an impact in lots of different parts of technology. And I think that's what's going to start to be an interesting trend to see in 2019, that serverless isn't going to just be a development thing. It's going to start to be an architectural pattern that starts to supersede just developers or DevOps or microservices. It's going to start to be we're almost cloud 2.0. I think that's what's going to be an interesting thing to see over the next year or two, because I think that's where we need to go with it. I think it's that whole thing of on-demand distributed computing, which is essentially what it is, which is where we're going to end up going with this. But we're missing the tools to be able to do that. So I think that's the kind of things we're going to end up needing, and I think that's probably where we're going to end up going.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And real quick for everyone, we'll just kind of close it out from here. If you are local to Hamburg, Austin, Boston, Amsterdam, Atlanta, Zurich, or New York City, there will be serverless days coming up in your area. So certainly take a look at the website, which
Definitely.
is serverlessdays.io. And Paul, where can everyone find out more about you, follow you, reach out to you, etc.?
So I'm on Twitter as Paul D. Johnston and Medium as Paul D. Johnston. Best places to find me.
Very good. Very good. Paul, it's always good to catch up with you. Folks, one last thing before we wrap up, a little bit of housekeeping. About 2.5 weeks until we do the Krispy Kreme run. As always, we're raising funds this year. We're about 65% of our goal. If you are interested in just kind of helping out the Cloudcast community, being part of it, helping some kids here in North Carolina and their families that need some help, the link is always off of the cloudcast.net in the upper right-hand corner, or if you go to our Twitter page, you'll find it in the bio. But Paul, thank you again for being on today. It's great to catch up. Aaron, I think this gives us some ideas for things to cover for 2019 around the serverless space. So, gentlemen, both of you, it's always great to talk to you. It's great to have you both on today. As always, folks, we're glad to bring this to you. We hope you enjoyed today's show, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.